Hey guys, how's it going? Jason Sensational here. Welcome back to the channel, where today we have another of 8 decks that I would recommend for you guys to climb, because we received a balance patch recently. The meta shifted even ever so slightly, and I just wanted to show off some decks that I think are performing quite well on ladder, and I recommend that you guys should try out as well, especially if you are trying to climb on this sort of meta's ladder. Sorry if I'm sounding a little bit sick. I received my booster shot yesterday, and I'm feeling a little bit under the weather. But, if you receive a booster shot, you should subscribe and like the video. But I will go over the 8 decks, and I hope you guys enjoy the video. So, starting with the meta staples, there have been 2 decks that have not really been touched by the patch, and these 2 decks have still remained some of 2 of the strongest decks in the meta right now. The first one, of course, is Ahri Kennen. This is a pretty prototypical standard list. This one has 2 Absolver splashes, but you might have seen this with Might, some other splash, some random dude hit rank 1, splashing Sunk Cost just because he felt like he wanted to show off. But very prototypical list. Just Ionia Allegiance with the Kinko Wayfinder and the Mourned. You may see some like go hard versions running around where they splash 3 go hards and they might add a little bit more card draw like the Sign and Thousand Tails, things like that. But overall, this list does have some flex spots, as I mentioned in my previous video on this deck, the Deep Dive Masterclass, whatever you want to call it. But this is probably the strongest deck at the moment. It just really doesn't have that bad of matchups. Even its poorer matchups, it still has a very, very decent way to hold on its own. In the slower matchups, you can just go slow with Ahri Droplet and just overwhelm your opponent with a lot of value, recalls, things like that. And against Aggro, you have the ability to kill your opponent's units using Kennen and his Mark of the Storm as a very efficient form of removal. In addition to its just annoyingly elusive game plan, it does have a lot of very, very cheap costed Ionia-based interaction, namely Notify, Twin Disciplines, Deny, Homecoming, and of course everyone's favorite Recall. Everything is just so efficient in this deck. It's a very, very well-tuned and oiled engine that just continuously cycles their cards, levels up your champions, and overall closes the game, even with a random splash. You could splash anything here, really, and you could beat anybody with it, as long as you know how to play it. So that's the first deck. I think, to no one's surprise, this has remained one of the best decks so far in the meta. The second list we have here is Shyv Pantheon. This is probably one of the more popular variations of Pantheon, but you have also seen Taric Pantheon or Mono Pantheon decks running in the meta as well. What this one does is it focuses a little bit more on the dragon mid-range stuff, having more units, 16 over, I think the usual lists have like 10 to 12 instead. So you have a lot higher unit density, but as a result, you have a lot fewer spells. So what this version aims to do is not only have a little bit better of a chump blocker against aggro, we do run 5 1-drops with the Dragon Chow and Fleet Feather Tracker, but we also have a little bit more of a consistent mid-range game plan because Dragon Chow does notably draw us a card. If we do play Wounded White Flame into Dragon Chow, we can actually draw 2 cards off of Dragon Chow, which is super, super impactful just as a little bit of a cycle engine. Now, with this list over the maybe Mono Pantheon list, we have Dragon's Clutch, whereas the Mono list has Zenith Blade. So we still have a way of getting overwhelmed to all of our dragons that will scale. Shyv definitely becomes a very, very big threat in the mid game. Overall, this is probably one of the best mid-range decks currently in the meta, just being able to outscale pretty much almost any other deck that tries to do the same thing. You have a lot of good and efficient combat tricks. You have the Faded keyword just to give you a little bit more buff, and of course you have cards like Rallies to close out the game. So very solid mid-range deck, probably the best one if you are looking to scratch that itch currently within this meta. Now this deck does have one very fatal weakness, and that is against Kennen Ahri. Kennen Ahri is probably one of the worst matchups for this deck, but should you not run into a lot of Kennen Ahri, this deck does have a lot better matchups throughout the rest of the meta. And so this is definitely worth picking up for a try, and just go see it for yourself. So now we're getting a little bit more into the effects of the patch. With the change to Iceborn Legacy now being a burst speed card, we have introduced 2 new decks into the meta that aim to just really abuse the power level of Iceborn Legacy. The first one, of course, is Poros. This is probably a very, very how should I say it? It's a very annoying deck that can just really high roll you out of Oblivion and just end the game with 5/5/5 Poros by turns 5/6. It is quite explosive in how it wants to work, but I think as the meta settled down, its win rate has dropped a little bit, settling within tier 2 area. So this deck does have its counters, but when it does work, it does really pop off, notably Daring Poro plus Iceborn Legacy, and the addition of Station Archivist as well as Poro Herder, just slight buffs to this kind of deck to not only help you draw your Poros a little bit easier, but also have the option to really tutor out your Iceborn Legacy or buff cards, excuse me. The second Iceborn deck is probably a little bit of a surprise to a lot of people, especially if you're new to the game, haven't really seen this sort of deck, or maybe you have, but don't expect to see Iceborn Legacy within it. This is Elise Trundle Howling Abyss. This is a control deck, but it aims to really use Iceborn Legacy to apply a lot of pressure to the opponent. So while we do have a slower game plan where we have the control SI cards like Ruination, Vengeance, even Withering Mist, Vile Feast, etc., and as well as Howling Abyss just as a late game value engine, we have very efficient manners of generating wide boards and a lot of stats in order to apply a lot of pressure to our opponent. We're even running 3 half Blissacurse cards and 2 Crawling Sensations within this deck just to generate more Spiralings. Along with Elise and Iceborn Legacy, we have the ability to just summon a lot of 3/3 spiders for very, very cheap. And then once Elise flips, which this deck actually does quite efficiently, all of our spiders now either have Challenger or Fearsome. Well, they have both, but the applications of either the Challenger or the Fearsome can prove very versatile in a lot of different matchups. I think Fearsomes right now are still very, very low key. A lot of decks just, again, struggle to deal with Fearsomes, especially if you are playing Kennen Ahri. You just don't really have any blockers, and you have the ability to just get rolled over. I think another interesting card that this deck does run that you won't see in other typical decks is Brood Awakening. This card has pretty much never been played since it got nerfed to 6 mana, but because we do run Iceborn Legacy, this is pretty much 6 mana to summon 3 4/3s, and that's a lot of stats for one spell and can swing tempo really easily. So definitely a deck that probably caught a lot of people off guard going to the expansion, but has performed quite well considerably, especially since that this does seem like a very, very bizarre list. Last sort of pseudo-control deck that does tease the buffed Kindred that I want to showcase with you guys is 4LW's Elise Ezreal Kindred deck. This is more of a PNZ Sentinel kind of control deck, and we've been seeing a lot of different variants within this sort of come out of the meta. We've seen a version with like Ledros and Karina, we've seen catalog versions, we've seen something like this. This deck has a lot of versatility and flexibility in all the different cards it wants to run, and again, it abuses very similar mechanics such as Fearsomes, namely with Sentinels, even Ledros, as well as Elise to apply a lot of early game pressure. The buff to Kindred is quite substantial, although in this particular deck it doesn't run any ways of protecting Kindred, which can be a little bit of a flaw because Kindred's 3 health line, it makes it quite vulnerable. However, for decks that really can't interact with Kindred, this becomes a powerhouse. Being able to just eat a unit a turn for free is very, very impactful and can slowly swing tempo. I don't know exactly which deck list I would recommend to you guys, just because all of these are pretty much flex spots in what you want to see in the meta. Like, you can take out this Aftershock, you can go extra Vengeance, you can potentially pair on with Ruination, maybe you want like a second Ledros, maybe you want Atrocity. There's a lot of different cards this deck can run, which makes it one of the more flexible decks, but this is a version that one of the players 4LW has been playing to quite high success, and so I would definitely go recommend at least giving this version a little bit of a shot. And now, finally, we reach the depths of Aggro. I think, to no one's surprise, I would recommend Aggro as quite a high proponent of decks to climb within this current meta, and that's namely because the top 2 decks right now, Pantheon Shyvana, whatever variant, as well as Ahri Kennen, whatever variant, are actually susceptible to Aggro decks. The reason why aggro decks such as spiders like this one can do very well into decks like Ahri Kennen as well as Pantheon is because they go wide really quickly. Into Ahri Kennen, we have Fearsomes, namely Stygian Onlooker, a 4-mana 4/1 Fearsome, just becomes a lot of damage to the opponent if they can't interact with it early on. This is probably one of the most powerful cards within this deck, and being able to abuse this early on can just swing games alone. Into Pantheon, we can go 6 wide on turn 3, while they might only have 1 unit, and then of course dealing damage to their face with a deck with very, very limited heal, often not just ends games on its own. So Spiders is one of the top contenders. It has probably pretty good meta stats right now, showing one of the top 4 most played decks, as well as pretty high win rate. So if you're looking for some fast games, Spiders is definitely the way to go, especially because it does very well into the top 2 decks. Just be a little bit careful of control decks. There are some running around, especially all the SI whale piles. You do need to be careful. This is definitely a very, very tailored deck to counteract the 2 best decks in the meta, but with the meta being quite wide, this does have susceptible counters. Now moving on to other sorts of aggro decks, we do have Draven Rumble here. This has been a deck that's sort of been splashed around occasionally throughout the last patch, and I think we're finally getting to some more refined versions of this deck. This deck is a very, very burn-oriented centric kind of deck, featuring Decimates as well as cards like Might, Get Excited, Mystic Shot, and Ballistic Bot. This deck definitely aims to apply a lot of pressure early on, sometimes even playing Rumble on 4 into a Might just to deal 10 damage to our opponent, and then finishing the game with cards like Decimate as well as Get Excited and Mystic Shot. I think this deck has been refined a little bit more with the addition of Whirling Death into this deck. This is probably one of the best cards that this deck could have used, and its addition to this deck has only made it a little bit more powerful. Now overall, this definitely is a very similar sort of deck to the old variants of Draven Scion, but this is a little bit faster, a lot more burn oriented, and just aims to apply a lot more pressure a lot quicker. And finally, for the last deck, I do wanted to showcase something that has been seeing a little bit of a reoccurrence, and that is Lulu Poppy. The classic Demacia Ionia rally deck has been showing some promising results. I think namely its performance into Kennen Ahri as well as the Iceborn elusives decks, this deck does quite well into, because, well, right now a lot of decks just can't deal with Poppy. Even if they can deal with Poppy, we do have the array of classic Ionia plus Demacia combat tricks, such as Ranger's Resolve, probably one of the most broken and efficient Demacia combat tricks that has ever been existed. But this deck does aim to abuse the fact that we have rallies, we have the elusive blockers as well, we can apply a lot of pressure. So very similar to a lot of the different aggro decks, works off the same way, but Lulu plus elusives plus a rally, again, does very, very well into the current meta. So this is a deck that has been seeing a little bit of resurgence. If this is a deck that, you really enjoyed last season, haven't really played it since the Poppy nerfs, now's the time to dust it off and try it out for yourself. These are 8 decks that I would recommend for you guys to take a look at during your climb. Hopefully it goes well. I believe there's pretty much another month or so to seasonal, so if that's a goal in your mind, you have a lot of time, and maybe as the meta adjusts, I might release another video detailing different decks, or just seeing the shifts out of what comes out of it. But hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Hopefully you guys have success playing online yourself. I will include all the deck lists of these 8 decks in the description, so feel free to use them as you suited, and hopefully you found something that piqued your interest. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time with your more regularly scheduled videos. See you guys, and peace out.